Well, the name of congressional committees used to be the one thing that no member of Congress was lying about. The very first committee established in the House of Representatives in 1789 was the Ways and Means Committee. That remains the name of that committee. It is archaic sounding language now, but it was very clear in 1789 that the Ways and Means Committee would provide the ways and the means for the government to do what it had to do. In other words, it would raise the money. Over the next couple of decades, Washington language evolved to a level of clarity that makes perfect and obvious sense today. And so in 1816, the Senate created the Finance Committee. Finance Committee in the Senate does exactly what the Ways and Means Committee in the House does. It raises the money through taxation and tariffs to pay for the government. The Finance Committee does what it sounds like it does. The Foreign Relations Committee has jurisdiction over exactly what it sounds like. The Veteran Affairs Committee, established in 1970, couldn't be more clear in its jurisdiction. It's right there in the title of the committee, as it is with virtually every other committee. And so it went until Republicans in today's House of Representatives thought up a new committee, which Alex correctly points out is actually a subcommittee, to be run by rabid, right-wing, election-denying, relentless, Trump-echoing Jim Jordan. And when you lie as much as Donald Trump and Jim Jordan, you are going to lie about the new House committee you create, and you are going to put the lie right there in the name of the committee. And that's why on this program, I avoid in every way possible saying the name of that committee, because that is Jim Jordan trying to force me to use his words, which are a lie, in describing the work of that committee. I don't have that problem with any other congressional committee in history, because committee names were never a lie until now. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to use the phrase semantic infiltration to describe this phenomenon. It's when you force your opponent to use your language to describe something. That's why, as I said, I never want to use the word Fox and the word news beside each other. Rupert Murdoch knew he could force the entire news industry to call what he was doing news when he created a television propaganda channel and called it news. If you use the word Fox and the word news beside each other, you are falling victim to Rupert Murdoch's semantic infiltration of your brain. And everyone in the news business does it. Rupert Murdoch owns that cell of their brains and forces them to call the poison that he spews news. In a deal Kevin McCarthy made with Republicans who are even more fanatical than he is, in order to get their votes to make him Speaker, he agreed to create a committee whose title is a lie. The committee's claim is that it would investigate the way government, especially the investigative powers of government, have been used in unfair ways. Now, I would be happy to cheer on a congressional committee like that if, for the first time in the history of the Congress, for example, they were going to take an interest in the ultimate governmental power, the power of government to kill, and how that might be used unfairly. If that committee were investigating, for example, how police officers, including federal law enforcement officers in the street, can unfairly become judge, jury, and executioner in one moment and kill unarmed people, particularly unarmed black men in the street, like Michael Brown and George Floyd, and thousands of others during my lifetime. That's a version of that committee that I could support and be interested in. I'm sure many other people could fairly support a committee that was fairly trying to investigate how governmental power can be used unfairly. But the Jim Jordan Committee was invented exclusively to pretend to investigate what they claim is investigative unfairness against Republicans, especially Republicans named Trump, by federal law enforcement officials and national security officials. They have not been able to come up with one day of true testimony demonstrating anything unfair in the federal investigative process. And surely there are many unfair things in the federal investigative process, but they aren't necessarily partisan things. So those things are of no interest to the Republican liars, and they are all liars on that committee, because the very first lie they tell every time that committee meets is the lie they tell about the purpose of the committee, which they have written into the very title of the committee. The only committee in congressional history whose name is a lie, whose name is, so far, a very successful execution of semantic infiltration. Everyone else in the news media uses the name of this committee as if it is the legitimate name of a congressional committee and as if it reveals something about what the committee actually does, instead of realizing that the mere utterance of the name of the committee is a participation in the lie that the committee's existence represents. Today, Jim Jordan presented 3 former FBI agents. They are former FBI agents for a reason. They have had their security clearances revoked. They violated the most elementary rules of the FBI in some cases. In a letter from the FBI to Jim Jordan, the FBI said that their, quote, allegiance to the United States was in doubt. That, of course, is true of Jim Jordan. His allegiance to the United States is in doubt. He tried to overturn the last presidential election illegally. His only known allegiance is to Donald Trump and to his own power. Jim Jordan claimed that the former FBI agents were whistleblowers, but blew no whistles today. And whistleblower is actually now an official status obtainable by law in Washington. And these 3 do not qualify legally for whistleblower status, but they do qualify for the description of disgruntled former employees. Marcus Allen's top secret security clearance was revoked after the FBI found that he had expressed sympathy for persons or organizations that advocate, threaten, or use of force or violence, the FBI letter to Jim Jordan said. Stephen Friend's security clearance was revoked after he refused last summer to take part in an arrest of a January 6th suspect. According to the FBI letter, Mr. Friend espoused an alternative narrative about the events at the U.S. Capitol. That was the FBI's phrase. And he espoused that narrative during his communications with his supervisors about refusing to participate in that arrest. The FBI letter also noted that in September 2022, Mr. Friend downloaded documents from FBI computer systems to an unauthorized, removable flash drive. That's an excellent reason to be a former FBI agent. Jim Jordan makes up his own rules as he goes along. So for the first time in congressional history, he has refused to share interview transcripts of witnesses with every member of the committee.
I'm not aware that you're able to withhold information from the minority that we would need to use to prepare for.
When it comes to whistleblowers, you're not. And I would just remind the committee, remind everyone. Look, when it comes to whistleblowers, you are not.
That's not right.
It's shocking that the gentleman.
That's not right.
It's shocking that
fact,
the gentleman.
You talk so much about the whistleblower and the impeachment.
It's shocking that the gentleman from New York would state that
we had
when you were part of an investigation with an anonymous whistleblower. When it comes to whistleblowers, you are not entitled to it. That's at the discretion of Mr. Allen.
Mr. Chairman, these individuals have been determined not to be whistleblowers. These are not whistleblowers. They've been determined by the agency not to be whistleblowers. Are you deciding that they're whistleblowers?
Yes, the law decides.
The law has not determined they are whistleblowers.
Congressman Ed Goldman cited the rules that Chairman Jordan clearly did not know exist.
The point of order is, why does Rule 11, Clause 2, subsection E1A not apply to this subcommittee? I can read for you. Each committee shall keep a complete record of all committee action, which shall include, in the case of a meeting or hearing transcript, a substantially verbatim account of remarks actually made during the proceedings, subject only to some technical things. Such records shall be the property of the House, and each member, delegate, and the resident commissioner shall have access thereto. Why does that not apply? Where is the whistleblower exception in the rules of Congress that says that does not apply?
It's the prerogative of the committee to decide.
No, it's the rules of the House.
We have the whistleblower testimony. The whistleblower does not wish that to be made available to the Democrats at this time.
The whistleblower doesn't make committee rules.
The senior ranking Democrat on the committee, Stacey Plaskett, who will join us in a moment, assessed the hearing this way.
Less than 2 months ago, former President Trump, facing mounting investigations into his many alleged crimes, declared that, quote, Republicans in Congress should defund the DOJ and the FBI until they can come to their senses. And we all know that when Trump says jump, the Republicans in the House say, how high? So here we are, on Police Week, watching House Republicans jump to lay the foundation to defund law enforcement. My colleagues on the far right are on a mission to attack, discredit, and ultimately dismantle the FBI. This is defund the police on steroids. As part of their mission, my colleagues have brought in these former agents, men who lost their security clearances because they were a threat to our national security, who, out of malice or ignorance or both, have put partisan agenda above the oath they swore to serve this country and protect its national security. My Republican colleagues aren't here representing their constituents, not my constituents. They're representing Donald Trump. They're acting as his defense attorney, his campaign operative, and everything in between. This committee, this select committee, is a clearinghouse for testing conspiracy theories for Donald Trump to use in his 2024 presidential campaign. What's clear from these hearings is that Donald Trump knows just as well as I do that the danger to him and his MAGA movement is the rule of law.